Welcome everybody to this tutorial on planning for all learners. This is an introduction to brain-based learning, learning styles, the difference between learning styles and multiple intelligences, as well as some of the other challenges that teachers are presented with in the classroom that cause them to have to be more responsive and differentiate. So, what is learning? That's a very difficult question. One that's not only at the heart of what makes our jobs so challenging, but it's also at the heart of what makes our profession sometimes so controversial and so ripe for debate and argument. Um, Teaching and education is not like, let's say, finance or a lot of aspects of the private sector where profit margin is your clear outcome or market share. It's very black and white. You're either achieving more market share or you're not. You're either earning a higher profit as a company or you're not. The fact that learning is this kind of nebulous, intangible, not only makes our jobs difficult as teachers as we're struggling to figure out if in fact students are learning, but it also makes our general profession and our learning, the communities that we teach in, more volatile places at times. So for the sake of our argument, we're going to really make a strong connection between learning and memory because there is a lot of science that helps us understand about what things people tend to retain. So for our purposes, we're going to kind of make learning and memory almost equal things. But I'm acknowledging that learning in itself is a very complex, nebulous thing, and that correlation may not be 100% rock solid. Okay, like we said in the previous slide, for the purposes of this presentation, we're going to talk about memory and learning as if they're the same thing. And as we said, that's a little controversial, but we do know that learning and memory are definitely linked, right? Particularly when you're talking about students learning blocks of content and blocks of knowledge. They have to be able to understand it, comprehend it, retain it, and remember it if they're actually going to learn it. So let's talk a little bit about how the brain and how memory works, all right? I mean, your senses, your ears, your eyes, they're receiving thousands of stimuli all the time. All this data, sounds, sights, etc. But your mind doesn't retain everything. For example, right now, if you're sitting in any kind of room that has central air conditioning, there's probably some kind of fan sound in the background. All right, now until I started talking about it, that wasn't a stimuli that your brain was going to remember. So in other words, there's some kind of process in your brain. There's receptors that use a variety of different variables to determine which information that you absorb is going to be retained or remembered, and which information is just going to come in, be received, and discarded. And this process is critical for us as teachers because if we understand it and we can work with it and manipulate it, it can really help students remember more and, in a sense, learn more. Okay, so as we said, your mind is constantly processing information, sounds, sights, etc., and constantly every millisecond making decisions on which information should be retained and which information should be discarded. So let's talk a little bit about the three real prime factors that help your mind make that determination. And the first is novelty, something that's strange, something that's out of place, something that's unique. And this has its roots, goes way back to our survival instinct days, when really survival was the main thing driving us and motivating us. From a teaching example, I can think of days, my early days of teaching, where I would rent crazy kinds of costumes that align to whatever the new topic I was introducing for a given unit, and come to that first day dressed in that costume. And it did have the effect because it was strange, because it was novel. I did notice that kids were a little more attentive that day and definitely much more likely to retain and remember things we discussed on the day. It caused me some strange looks at traffic lights when I was, driving to work dressed up as things like George Washington and things like that. But it was effective. The second factor is any kind of intensity level, whether it's the volume of your voice. You think about people that are monotone speakers and how you tend to zone out and kind of forget what they're talking about, as compared to people who are very effective at using the different volume levels of their voice to make emphasize certain points. And the last factor is movement. You've probably heard about kinesthetic teaching, which is the discipline of teaching things through movement, making students get up and move to learn certain points. And there's a whole bunch of research to show that that really helps the mind retain information. Okay, at this time, I'd like you to think about some of the things we've talked about so far about the way the brain processes information and decides what to remember and what to discard. Log on to the Moodle site and respond to the post titled Determining Factors, where you'll be asked to reflect on what we've just talked about and think about how you would use that information to improve teaching in your classroom. Okay, let's continue our conversation about factors that determine whether or not the mind processes and retains as opposed to discards. So let's start talking about meaning and patterns, because that is so essential, and I think it's such an obvious factor that we all understand that when things are familiar, we have a tendency to focus on them more and are much more likely to remember that information down the road. Now, there's a definite neurological basis to this, in the sense that as information is brought in and received, neural networks come together and circuit that information. And when new information is brought in, there's a tendency of the mind to look at those circuits and see if there's any commonality as to the way they were circuited in the past. And if there is a match, the brain kind of focuses on this information and processes it in the long-term memory. As neurologists say, neurons that fire together survive together. Now, what this means for you as a teacher boils down to something we refer to in the profession as connectivity. The idea of always trying to build a bridge between your content, whatever it is, to the lives and interests of your students. And the whole reason that you're doing this goes back to that neurological pattern piece, that if the students can connect whatever it is you're teaching, from the structure of a cell to the Pythagorean theorem, if that connects to something that they've already processed and circuited in their mind, there's a much more likelihood that they're going to retain that information. I think when you think about this factor of meaning and patterns, probably the teaching strategy that we're all most familiar with is mnemonics. We all remember I before E except after C. And we all remember how teachers used to use certain patterns, Sakatoa and Roy G. Biv, and rhymes and songs to help us remember certain things. And it worked. I mean, you never forget those things because your neurons circuit them in a common pattern. Now, although mnemonics are very effective at helping us remember certain facts, like whether or not to put an I or an E after a C, they do have their limitations. When we want students to retain information that's kind of higher on the Bloom's taxonomy, more critical thinking sort of things, that's where mnemonics isn't so great. When that's our main focus, searching and linking the information to a higher purpose or some kind of emotional tag is a much more effective way to get students to remember that information. So let's continue talking about this concept of using emotional tags to help students remember, to help students learn. So as stimuli come in, they're processed first by the thalamus and then either sent to the cortex or the amygdala. Now the cortex processes rational action, while the amygdala is looking for things that make you emotional, sad, happy, angry, etc. Now, one of the things we now know is that the distance between the thalamus and the amygdala is shorter than that between the thalamus and the cortex. So emotional messages get processed quicker, and maybe that's why we tend to remember things with emotional tags more. But this is a really critical information for a teacher. Now, it's not always possible to make emotional linkages to the content you're teaching, but it is important that we know this, and it is important that as teachers we reflect on this and always try to make those emotional connections. Maybe emotion's not always the right word to, when you're teaching math and science, sometimes it's more difficult to make those emotional tags than if you were teaching a social studies class or a literature class. So maybe think more about higher purpose than emotion. But I think for the neurological purposes, I think you'll get the same kind of benefit. Okay, so I'd like you to reflect on the conversation we've been having about patterns, about connectivity, about connecting, the power of connecting new content to something that's familiar to the students, and also the concept of emotional tags and higher purpose. And think about that and respond to the journal title, Meaning is Everything, and explain, now that you know that, how would you use that in the math or science classroom? So now we're going to talk a little bit about learning styles and multiple intelligences, two concepts that are frequently confused for each other. So we're going to talk briefly about learning styles today. We'll go really into depth in the learning styles later on in the semester when we focus on differentiated instruction. But for now, let's just talk about learning styles as it's the way a person learns, a way they acquire knowledge. It's not what they learn, but it's I guess it's a way of framing out that each of us is unique and we each have certain preferences and how we're going to learn something, whether we want to learn it from somebody telling it to us verbally, whether we want to see it, whether we want to touch it. That's really what learning styles are all about. Now, for this week's conversation, we're going to focus more on multiple intelligences than learning styles. And you can't talk about multiple intelligences without talking about Howard Gardner's frames of mind. This is a piece that had a tremendous impact on our profession, came out in the early 1990s, and it really attempted to define what smart is and recognize that being smart is not just one thing. Being smart is more than being able to score a high SAT score. And that intelligence can be broken down into different components. And all of us possess certain elements, certain levels, higher and lower, of each of these. I think each of them are pretty self-explanatory by their name, but we'll go through them quickly. Bodily kinesthetic, that would be the athlete or the dancer, somebody that has great hand-to-eye coordination, great psychomotor skills. This is a form of intelligence. The intrapersonal person is a person that really can reflect on their own thoughts, actions, and emotions and kind of analyze them and dissect them well. The interpersonal skill is the person that really excels at communicating and influencing other human beings. The linguistic person is the person who really is the master of the written and spoken word and communicating that way. Logical mathematical is kind of self-explanatory. These are people that like to attack problems very analytically and quantitatively. Musical person, again, pretty self-explanatory about what kind of intelligence that is. And the visual spatial person is really that hands-on designer, the person that excels at woodworking, repairing engines, doing things with their hands. That would be considered visual spatial intelligence. So in the big sense, this week really is about responsive teaching, and we're talking about different things that you really need to consider if you're going to be a responsive teacher. And we started out talking about brain-based teaching and how to understand the neurological process of how the mind learns and remembers. And then we started talking about multiple intelligences, acknowledging that there's different kinds of smart. But also, we have to consider cultural diversity. If we're really truly going to be responsive teachers, then we need to be responsive to students' cultural backgrounds as well as how they think or how they show what they've learned. So when you think about cultural diversity, think about the kinds of examples and metaphors that you use in your class, and make sure that you're being sensitive to the students' diversity. And they are not always selecting metaphors that maybe come from one particular culture. Be knowledgeable about your students, be knowledgeable about the backgrounds they come from, and try to provide examples and metaphors that appeal to all of your students. And obviously, you yourself are never going to make prejudicial remarks, but you also have to listen very carefully to what your students are saying, and you can't let any prejudicial remarks that come from your students go as well. They have to be addressed immediately. Creating opportunities for your students to learn how to work in diverse environments is critical. Your students are going to have a natural tendency to want to work with their friends or work with students that are like them. That's why really teacher-created groups are so essential. This gives you an opportunity to create culturally diverse groups and give your students opportunity to become more and more comfortable with working with students who are different from them. Last but not least, when you're communicating with families of different cultures, try to do your best to do a little homework about and finding out what the language background is at the home. And most schools have great resources and support people to help you if there is a language barrier at home to help you communicate to increase the efficacy of all of your families regardless of what their cultural background is. So as a responsive teacher, there are so many different things that you have to be aware of and respond to beyond the things we've talked about so far. First, biological, disabilities, developmental levels. You will be working with students with many different kinds of disabilities, speech, cognitive, social, etc. And all of those come into play, and all of those present different challenges to you in being a truly responsive teacher. In addition, socioeconomics. Socioeconomics are one of really the only non-debatable factors that drive achievement. The socioeconomic background and the efficacy of the families of your students has a direct impact on their ability to succeed in your classes, and it's really going to challenge you in terms of being responsive. And last but not least, there's the psychological posturing, for learning. Is the student ready to learn? Do they trust you? Do they have self-esteem and confidence in themselves? If a student isn't comfortable in their own skin and a student isn't comfortable working with you, chances are they're not going to be able to learn. That has to be addressed, and that has to be responded to. Okay, now it's time to take everything that we've talked about and complete your differentiation exercise. This exercise is going to ask you to select from, I think, 2 or 3 different pre-designed math and science lessons. First, think about what we've talked about and try to identify which intelligence or intelligences this lesson is currently designed for. And then you're going to have to be a responsive teacher and modify it to a different predetermined intelligence based on whatever you select.